Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be starting in just a minute, so that this will allow some people to log in. Just give us a minute. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Depends on where you're joining us from. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I'm the CEO and president of WRI. I'm absolutely delighted. So many of you could join us in this conversation of the state of the transportation system. We are very excited to host this discussion today in partnership with the System Change Lab, the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities, as a prelude to next year's 20th Annual Transforming Transportation 2023. This is a forum that's organized jointly with the World Bank and WRI, and this is our 20th year, and you will meet with Ben in a minute, who is representing World Bank in this forum. I wanted to take a moment, just a moment, to say a few words about the broader context and landscape that is a backdrop of today's discussion on the transportation system. You all know, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, the science is more clear than ever. To halt biodiversity loss and to build a fair economy, nearly every major system that we know that will need to, each one of them need to transform, including how we move around, power economies, grow food, build cities, conserve nature, and beyond. At the same time, cross-cutting transitions must also occur in political system, in social system, economic systems, such as how do we finance these transitions, evolve measures of economic prosperity, govern our shared natural resources, and ensure that everyone benefits from the sustainable economy. If you're to create a sustainable and just future for all, we must navigate these with the systems lens. This is exactly the reason why we created the System Change Lab, which is a collaboration between WRI, the Bezos Earth Fund, and many other organizations, in response to the urgent need for these transformational changes. We have identified more than 70 critical shifts across major systems that needs to happen. These shifts range from phasing out internal combustion engine, to extending financial service to undeserved communities, to adopting more holistic indicators for economic well-being, to developing solutions for hard-to-abate industries like steel, cement, plastics, to restoring deforestation of degraded land. These shifts can work together to disrupt the status quo and create systemic change. And this systemic change, as all of us know, is what we're looking for. The lab, as you can see in the slide, has three pillars in our strategic scope of work. One is monitoring. What does that mean? It means it's within each shift identified, the System Change Lab measures how much progress is being made towards 2030 goals or 2050 goals based on what are the scientific targets there are, as well as focus on what are the enablers for these targets and what are the barriers. The second thing we do is learn and share, which is today's focus. System Change Lab is working to produce analysis, identifies ingredients for transformational change, details of what is working and what is not, and what kind of lessons can we share. Recently, System Change Lab collaborated with another organization to publish, how do we understand tipping points? How do we know something will just exponentially get better? For example, a few years back, as electric cars have come, or batteries. And the third thing we do is nudge and campaign. We are modeling and equipping partner organizations, messengers, and the coalition to accelerate this change towards the direction we need. So overall, we're trying to be a place that we can look at all the systems, what needs to change, and how well we're doing, how far we're doing, and what we need to do to go faster. To do that, we have created this wonderful shared tool called the Virtual Situation Room. The System Change Lab is now an open source data platform to serve as a virtual situation room to showcasing research analysis, interactive dashboard, data visualization. So you can go in there And all of you can go in there and see what is one data, how is it interacting with others, how can we make progress. It arms people like you, it arms funders, policy makers, decision makers, and leaders in private sector, civil society, and government with insights on progress of required system transformation so they can focus on what the action to be taken. We believe data on its own is not that useful, but if it allows you to make better decisions and actually allows you to use the scarce resources we have to the most impact, then data is useful. That is what we're striving for. Today, we're going to dive deep into one of the sectors dive deep into transportation systems. Soon hear from these brilliant people that you see on the screen right now. These leaders from across the world, they work on transportation in various different ways, will join us today to discuss and how to actually make progress. And I'm very, very grateful to all of you, all our panelists for joining us. But before we jump into the panel discussion, I want to hand the floor to Felipe Ramirez. Felipe is our Urban Mobility Director, and he is WMO Director of the W.R. Ross Center. He's an expert. He's been running systems like transportation system in Bogota for years. And he will offer us to frame the discussion today. Felipe, over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's my pleasure to do these opening remarks and willing to hear the panel coming next. We all know transport must be understood from the perspective of people. This is because transport connects humans, makes cities more productive, and give opportunities for everyone, especially vulnerable people who are the ones we work for. And these vulnerable people must have access for jobs, study, and leisure. As economies and population grow, so too does the need of efficient, accessible, and sustainable mode of transport. Travel. That's why, as you mentioned, Annie, in order to meet goals to keep the global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, major actions across the transport systems are needed. Our current global transport systems accounts for 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and these emissions continues to grow. But then there is a major question that we have to raise, and what is that we have to do in order to work at the same time to solve climate change, pollution, congestion, unsafe roads, poor access for opportunities, and so on. We must approach transforming transportation with a system perspective, because no one solution by itself is going to solve it, and we all know that. For example, electric vehicles can help reduce greenhouse gases, but we really need to shift in how we move to meet our goals, especially for vulnerables, of course. Our cities are very unequal, and we need to tackle this immediately. We also know transport systems need to be more resilient. From the effects of COVID-19 and Russian invasion of Ukraine to flooding and extreme heat, the world's transport system are struggling to keep up, and we need to build infrastructure that can weather changes better and not induce more fossil fuel use. But we need to find reliable and easy way to help cities in terms of finance to support all work that has to be done. That's why on the next slide, we know, or we understand, that there are 5 shifts needed to transform the transport systems. The first one, and we must guarantee reliable access to safe and modern mobility. The second one, we need to reduce available vehicles and air travel. The third one, shift to public, shared, and non-motorized transport. The fourth one, transition to zero carbon cars and trucks. And then the fifth one, transition to zero carbon shipping and aviation. Here, I want to tell you, next week, we are co-hosting with the World Bank, the Transforming Transportation Conference. There, we will have the opportunity to discuss a bit more on these 5 specific topics and accelerate actions needed to implement projects, which is actually what we have to work on, to accelerate actions in order to be able to implement things that we need right now. Unfortunately, what we have done so far is not enough. Within these shifts, while many indicators are heading the right direction, none of them are showing that we are at the pace needed to meet the 2030 goals. It is a mixed picture. Transition to zero carbon vehicles is moving a bit faster than others, but we need to accelerate light-duty e-vehicles sales by 5 times, as opposed to the more than 10 times progress needed in building out high-quality bike lanes. On the next slide, we have identified with the Systems Lab enablers and barriers. There are 5 of them, and there are signs that we are doing some of these things good. However, we need to understand these 5 categories factors that can be both enablers and barriers of change, as I mentioned, and I'm sure our panel will get into these specific topics. These levers will help drive durable transformational change. There is no one solution, as I mentioned before, and it will take economic incentives, regulations and laws, shifts in behaviors, innovation, and underwaving courageous leaderships. So we're moving on to our panel. As I mentioned, next week, we will be diving into these issues more at Transforming Transportation, and I invite you all to join virtually or in person. We hope this event helps set the stage for our week ahead, and I look forward to the panel discussion here today. So it's my pleasure to pass back to you, Annie, to host our panel of high-level leaders to speak these latest trends in the transport system.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Thank you very much. And I repeat what Felipe said. We invite all of you to join Transforming Transportation is it next week, Felipe? Next week?
Yes, next week.
And either in person or virtually. Ben just assured me that it will be live cast, so you can see it. All right. I want you to meet our fantastic panelists now, and I'm going to go directly to get going. Marusha, to you. I've had distinct pleasure to work with Marusha for many, many years. Marusha Kadma is the Secretary General of SLOCAT, the Partnership for Sustainable Low Carbon Transportation. Marusha, the question, I want to ask you a big general question. Felipe laid out how much we need to do, right? Where we are, what we need to, what all the things we need to, I'd like the 5 shifts he mentioned, the 5 big shifts we need. I wanted to ask you, what you see is the big ticket item in a global transportation policy right now that are receiving the most attention, the international discussion, international negotiations, in different fora, and what gaps, and I wanted to focus on the gaps, like what is not happening, what are people not talking about in the global discussion. Marusha, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Annie and Felipe. What a delight to be here, really, isn't it? Well, I think that overall we do see a lot of emphasis on the decarbonization conversation, perhaps to the detriment of a conversation on the wider sustainability impacts, isn't it? On aspects like an equitable access to transport, traffic deaths, traffic congestion, and air pollution. And these often tends to translate in a lot of emphasis on transport electrification, particularly of e-cars and e-vans. So I think that we should make an effort to broaden the conversation and contextualize, for starters, that conversation on transport electrification. How can we do that? Perhaps paying more attention to elevating transport electrification at the service of intermodality, and at addressing as well the risk of transport electrification becoming a sort of divide between high-income countries and low-income countries. For instance, in freight, we could be looking at more attention towards combining electrified trains and electrified trucks for long distances. In passenger transport, we could be paying more attention to conversations on electrifying the intermodal chain from collective transport, whether formal or informal, to electrify 2- and 3-wheelers for the last mile. And certainly we must pay more attention to having transport electrification becoming the leader, the spearhead movement of providing access to renewable energy across the world. We also know that in some low and middle income countries, perhaps it's time for us to have conversations about what is the best use of scarce public resources. In some occasions, it might not be transport electrification as such. It might be perhaps putting those funds to the creation of public transport, or working with local private finance to electrify informal transport, or the omnipresent 2- and 3-wheelers that we see so much in low and middle income countries. And I think that we should have more conversations about a certain risk of neocolonialism, if you allow me to use that expression. I think it's been very interesting to see Zimbabwe ban the exports of raw lithium. That was on the news, isn't it? A little while ago, not that long ago. But perhaps let's go back to this question of other big tickets that we see in global transport policy discussions right now. I would argue that the concept of the 15-minute city is also getting a lot of traction. As such, the concept is no last cry technology. We know that it feeds itself from currents that have been there over many decades, isn't it? But I think it's very refreshing, this attention that we see in global policy debates that somehow popped up at the same time as a temporary cycling and pedestrianization structures popped up in cities across the world, particularly at the peak of pandemic. But perhaps we need a bit more of nuanced attention to certain aspects of this concept if we really want to put it at the service of systemic transformations. What could that be? I would argue that perhaps it's three aspects. It's first, enabling multidisciplinary work, which is at the core of this concept. Second, adapting the application of the concept to the context of sprawling and informal urban development in the global south. And third, facilitating the discussions about a change in lifestyles across different geographies. We know that we have important gaps in integrating the practices of transport planners, urban planners, real estate developers, healthcare sector. We have similar gaps in policy and funding across governmental departments or between public and private financiers. We also do not want this concept of the 15-minute city become, if you want, in global south contexts of informal urban development, a notion that ends up provoking another layer of social segregation. And then last but not least, let's not forget that the 15-minute city is very much about reducing our dependency on cars. During the 20th century, we have associated values of socioeconomic development, personal success to owning a private car, to sitting in the private car, to move around, even if it is to sit in a traffic jam. So I think that we have to pay a lot more attention to enabling and facilitating conversations, these difficult conversations about a change in lifestyle across different geographies. Encompassing everything I've said, and here I'm already approaching a bit at the end of what I wanted to share, I see two overarching aspects on which we see conversation, but perhaps what we don't see, it's the conversations about enabling the action at the scale that is required. One is finance for public transport and active mobility. And the other one is, if you want, the overarching alignment of funding and financing with the principles of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and the SDGs. We must enable investors and users to provide and to request the most sustainable transport services. And we know that public transport is the most cost-efficient manner of decarbonizing people's daily lives while giving them access to jobs, to socio-economic opportunities. The vast majority in the people in the world are actually relying on public transport and walking and cycling. Particularly lower income groups depend massively on these three modes. But it's shocking to see that around the world, over 60% of people do not really have access to a formal public transport system, or that millions die annually when they try to actually walk and cycle in environments that are not safe. So we do really need to see more attention to enabling action for financial institutions to shift their transport portfolios, to redefine their lending criteria based on wider sustainability practices. And obviously, I couldn't, stop these first few reflections with you without saying an obvious thing. We need to really stop subsidies to fossil fuels in the transport sector. We need to phase them out and rechannel those funds somewhere else. And we really need to enable those very tough conversations that are oftentimes related to the just transition of our social and economic systems. So Felipe has talked about these 5 shifts. I think they are spectacular. Kudos for that work. In Slowcat, we believe that the just transition is very much what we need to do if we want to reach equitable, healthy, green, and resilient transport systems that are at the service of socioeconomic prosperity. But if we only work on the green part, on the decarbonization part, we are not really going to get to the systemic transformation we need. That's a bit the message. So thanks very much, Hani. Over to you.
Marusha, that's a terrific framing of, I think, the bigger dilemmas we face. I love the fact that you brought the issue of access and being just in this transformation, and not only just focusing on the mitigation part of the story, but how everyone, and as an urban planner myself, I actually found the controversy on the 15-minute story kind of unexpectedly interesting. right? I mean, we didn't expect that that's how it'll pan out. So
Absolutely.
I find I want to pick up two things you said. Ben, I'm going to come to you. People who don't know Ben, I'm sure all of you know Ben. Ben Ria is the global practice manager for transportation practice in the infrastructure vice presidency of the World Bank. I've been working with Ben for many, many years. Actually, when I was in World Bank with Ben. Ben, I want to pick up where Marusha left off on two issues, on access, which she made a first point, but on public transport infrastructure. All of us know, the science tells us, you just saw Felipe says, in developing countries, public transport infrastructure, which is not very good in a general way, is critical for us to not only provide access, but also decarbonize. But at the same time, Ben, you know this very well, we have seen, unfortunately, in middle-income countries that are growing, actually a very steady increase of motorization from Mexico to Brazil to India. I can keep on naming countries one after another. So how do we reverse this, Ben? What is the system change we need on both positively and also stopping motorization?
Great. Thank you, Ani. First of all, let me just thank WRI for organizing this as a plenary session in advance of next week's Transforming Transportation. I think this is a very good prelude, and I'm very delighted to be here with all of you and to speak into this topic. So yeah, I think Marusha really framed it very well. Public transportation is by far the most effective tool we have for decarbonizing the transport sector, also for providing equitable access to the public. Yeah, but as you say, Annie, motorization has been increasing not only in the middle income countries, but even in low income countries, even in Africa, we see motorization going rapidly. And this motorization is being met by secondhand used cars that are actually double whammy in a sense, you can say, because they're highly polluting and they're unsafe. So just things get compounded. So how do we crack this nut? So improving the public transportation system is going to be hugely essential. But first of all, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is public transport is no longer about just a fixed route, scheduled bus service, system. It encompasses many subsectors within it. But nonetheless, we need to think in an hierarchical way. First and foremost, we need to invest quite a lot on a high occupancy public transportation system like BRTs and metro as the backbone of the public transportation system. I think many cities have the density in the developing world and the demand to actually make them economically viable. It used to be that metros or BRTs were for very high income cities, but now we're seeing them actually to be very relevant for many lower income cities as well. So in the World Bank, we have at least about 11 BRT projects in Africa and many more in Latin America and MENA as well that we are either in the process of developing or already under implementation. So BRTs would be crucial, so our metro, when the cities can afford it. Many people talk about the lack of affordability or fiscal system, but now we have grown in the sense that we've figured out how to pay for those investments through innovative financing, introducing additional levies, betterment levies, and capturing the land value appreciation that comes along through this improvements and bringing it back to improving the transportation system. So that's one, I think, on the backbone. But then many cities, this is why I like your system approach, because then you just don't stop there. If you're talking about system, it's not just only about improving one corridor or one line, but rather the whole municipality. You can have the most beautiful BRT line in one corridor, but the city may be actually going down the hills, getting severely congested. And that's what we see in many places. So in this system approach, then integrating the informal transport or the paratransit, whatever you call them, is going to be hugely important. And integrating can mean a lot. It means to provide them dedicated routes, exclusive routes, so that you minimize the severe competition that happens among them. Many cities around the world try to regulate out of informal transport out of existence. That just never works, and it's socially suboptimal and economically nonsensical in my view. So the thing to do is to really bring the minibus operations to upgrade their quality of service, improve their driving behavior, and in a way regularize them, because they provide services that the city municipality cannot do. And at the same time, they're also a good source of income and for many people and for many families, and also reducing the fiscal burden on the city, because the city cannot provide the entire system. So
But
they
they
are
also
very
provide a service at a price point that people want.
yeah, exactly. So the market clears very well. Yes, good point. So I think we have to do that. And then we have to also look at the new shared mobility system that we have that are emerging, shared rides, especially when you are trying to pool the services, not just one person sitting in the back and taking over, but rather pulling different people, especially in low demand in thin market area, this kind of demand responsive shared mobility system. And we have the technology now. And again, even this technology is no longer a high income privilege. We see it in African city and Kenya, in West Africa. Now they're using Uber-like apps to coordinate services. So I think this last mile connectivity is through the shared mobility system is one. So we have to get all of this. But then finally, when we're talking about decarbonization, we must also remember electrification has to be part of that equation. It's not, yeah, I mean, electrification of buses and maybe two-wheelers and three-wheelers is well in the realm of many developing countries, especially those that have renewable energy, even those maybe not in the process of getting renewable. So our recent World Bank report, as you know, Annie, really looked at into the economics of e-mobility, and the clear finding is that electric buses and two-wheelers and three-wheelers make economic and climate sense for many of our countries. So we do need to be part of that, and it's not, again, shouldn't be only for high-income countries, again, because we don't want we are in the era of energy transition. That's what I like to say. And we need to make sure we are also transitioning with energy while still maintaining our focus on public transportation or active mobility. But the electrification component has also to be front and center and helping our client countries to achieve that goal. Thank you, Annie. And I think this is my
Thank you
response
very
to you.
much, Ben. Thank you. I like the electrification point you made. I mean, we are seeing across the world now, especially in India, the massive procurements actually shifting the price of electric buses. The electric buses in India now are price competitive, actually somewhere actually less than diesel buses. So this point you made about being usable, affordable in a different context, in an emerging economy context. But I really like, Ben, that the point you made about systems approach here, because we need all systems to work, not just the high density systems like BRTs and metros. But in most cities, the smaller cities, Ben, we need just simply the bus system to work. And there is a massive gap on how many bus or how many cities actually have a transportation system. So very much like, and I want to take Ben's point, Sandra, if I can come to you. Sandra Rawling is the head of Transport, the climate group. For a system to work, Sandra, I mean, I just want to bring in the role, the very important role private sector plays, whether it's informal or formal, it doesn't matter. It is a critical piece of the puzzle. You were the founding secretary of the Women Business Coalition and played a very important role since then in the climate group's business campaign and engagement. You were very much part of EV100 that we were part of in mobilizing that campaign. So my question to you is the business case for encouraging, large scale shift in the transport sector. And if you were now giving advice to companies looking to turn these commitments that people are making to action, what would you advise them in 2023? What role and what shifts can private sector play to push the system change that we need?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Annie, and very, very glad to be here. So I should maybe caveat by saying, so a lot of the work that I'm currently doing focuses on electric vehicles, but sort of based on, what previous speakers have said, we do that from a very systems point of view. So, and the idea is we are shifting one market, one industry that provides road transport vehicles, because ultimately, no matter exactly how we organize transport, who uses the vehicles, ultimately they all need to be zero emission, right? So in some ways we've picked our role as pushing that, but it obviously relates to all these other types of topics as well. With regards to your question, I think for businesses, in some ways I feel these days is the climate case is the business case. I think the companies that we work with, we're way past the moment where we think about climate change or sustainability as sort of a nice add-on that maybe business can engage with if they have a bit of extra capacity, but it's really about recognizing that, climate change is a reality. It needs to be part of strategy making. And we all know that we need to halve emissions by 2030. So that's a very steep curve. And sooner or later, we will all need to shift the systems. And I think businesses, certainly the leading ones, are very aware of that. And in that context, is sort of thinking about what is our role within that? Where can we make the shift? It's really, it's part of future-proofing your business ultimately, right? You want to be operational, you want to be ready for regulatory change, etc. And that's where I think in some ways, road transport and electric vehicles is an easy piece to focus on comparatively, because the solution is there. We now have the technology, we can make the shifts that depending on where you are in the world and what the types of vehicles are that you're looking at there, there's some good advice and service provision and other guidance available for how you would do that. And I think businesses really have that sense that this is an area we can look at, that is a very significant part of our emissions, and also they can really be part of driving the market, right? We've talked to, when you think about things like total cost of ownership, upfront cost, etc., businesses obviously have a different capacity to think about that than maybe the average consumer has. So in that sense, I think there's a big opportunity for businesses to go first in some of these developments. And that's obviously how we're working with them. And so in terms of advice, how to get started, I think it's really about understanding your impact first, right? The old sort of, adage of you can only manage what you can measure. And then setting yourself a goal. I think for transport, particularly the community that works on electric vehicles, there's a consensus that, we need to phase out light duty ICE vehicles by 2035, the latest heavy duty vehicles by 2040. So that's a trajectory. And you as a business can obviously mirror that and think about where can I contribute there? What is my opportunity? You set an end goal and then you define the milestones and obviously try to work from the easier to the more difficult pieces. And I think one of the things that we are really encouraging businesses to do is to think about leadership, not just as getting your own house in order these days, but about being part of the transition, right? Thinking about how can I work with others? How can I be part of a policy dialogue? How can I think about sort of my transport needs and capacities in a different way together with others in order to make that shift all the faster? Because ultimately, any S-curve is sort of the more people get involved, the faster the progress ultimately goes. And that's obviously what we need to build towards if we're going to stay anywhere close to the 1.5 degrees that we're aiming for.
Sandra, I really like that. This is my absolute agreement with you that the business leader need to think beyond their own business to be real leaders in the shift they need, and how they can push their supply chain, their purchasers in both in scope 3. So I very much agree with what you're saying about leadership in business. And we see that in some companies. But I think businesses is going to play a very important role, and they already are in the transportation revolution. If I have time, Sandra, I want to come back to Marusha's point about the tension between access and electrification, perceived tension. I don't think there are tensions all the time, but how do we balance that? But I want to, Deputy Prime Minister Bosch, I hope I can bring you in now. I hope all of you know Deputy Prime Minister Bosch from Luxembourg. He's been an absolute champion of the Star Pay from many, many years, so both in this country and globally, and we have had a privilege to partner with you. I want to come to your favorite topic, which is, as you heard from Ben, we need to take a systems approach. We need motorized system, we need public transport, but we also need critical piece is active mobility. In cities after cities that we work in the global south, we find 25%, 30% people actually still walk to wherever they need to go. So walking, biking are a critical piece of the solution that we haven't historically focused, because we always focus historically on the heavy infrastructure. You have actually championed active mobility as a central part of a transportation revolution, walking, cycling. I would love to hear not only your experience in Luxembourg, which has been super successful, but what do you see as the challenges globally, especially in Global South, to bring this in? And there's this modern kind of a new form of mobility that includes old form of doing things, which is walking and biking. Over to you.
Thank you, Annie. First of all, I want to congratulate you that you choose the topic of changing transport as a system, because like Felipe said already, there is no one solution if you want to change things in the transport sector. And the second thing is that what he said about making cities more productive. I will say, let's make the whole transport system more productive. And then with this, then observing that there is not only one solution, but there is only not that you must only not only look at the technological solutions, but also look at which possibilities we have and which are very easy to implement. And we must also see that in every society, no matter if it is in a rich country or a poor country, 1/3 of the population, they don't have access to cars, for example, because they are too young, they have no driver license, or too old because they cannot drive anymore, they won't not drive anymore. So we exclude immediately the access for mobility to 1/3 of the population if you only base your transport system on individual motorized systems. So, and from this point of view, active mobility plays an enormous role. That starts by pedestrian. You must completely redesign our cities, or even like in developing countries, start to design from the beginning on your cities so that pedestrians have their place. So, for example, that you have an infrastructure where pedestrians can walk safe, where they can walk in a very decent way. And the second point is cycling. Cycling is also very important because for distances, especially today with electric bikes, pedelecs, you can easily run 15, 20 kilometers with your bike without having any problem. The only thing that you need to have is a good infrastructure, a secure infrastructure where you have to ride. And the costs for to favor us pedestrian and also cycling in the cities and all around the country, it's really very much below of everything else you have to invest for other modes of transport. And then you must also think that in most of the societies, 50% of the daily movements that people are doing are under 5 kilometers, so very short distances. Or even in my country, for example, we have 33% of the movements are under 1 kilometer. So really not distances who really, or distance who are very, very interesting for walking and for cycling. And that's really a shift in our mentality that we have to really to implement, really to see what is the enormous potential of this soft mobility. And in my country, cycling, for example, had nearly completely disappeared. 10, 15 years ago, if you cycled around in the city, for example, you were alone in the streets and people thought this guy is crazy running on a bike. But now with the infrastructure that we are implementing, each infrastructure that we are building, immediately the people are taking it and really restart to cycle. We have a renaissance of cycling everywhere in the world, and not only because of the pandemic, because it started already before. And we have to see this chance really to redesign our landscape, our cities, to allow cycling in general. So it's an enormous chance. Changing the mobility system means to see what is the real potential of each mode of transport. And that's the same also for our infrastructure. If you have a street which is completely congested, what we did in the last decades was then, oh, the street is congested, we have to enlarge the street. But we never asked us questions, the cars in the street, how many people are sitting in these cars? Would it not be better if we decide to enlarge the street, then also to look at what will be more productive if we enlarge it, for maybe reserve, for example, one lane then for cycling or for buses or for other things. So the infrastructure must be there to move people and not to move vehicles. And that's really that's the paradigm shift that we have to understand if we want to change things. And then for the benefit of this, compared of what you have to invest, if it is for private companies or for a local government or for a national government, the money that you invest, the return on invest that you get if you change the mobility system is enormous. Because if we do nothing and continue like this, the loss of biodiversity that we have, the climate change problems that we have, everything that is linked with the loss of the quality of life in urban areas, for example, because they are completely stuck by cars. The price that you have to pay in 5, 10, already today is very high, but it will be higher and higher. So in 5, 10, 15 or 20 years, it will be such a high price to pay. So if you invest today in another system, we also make then, in general, our economy much more productive and much more competitive. I'm sure that the countries, the regions, the cities that understands that you have to change this whole system will be the winning cities in the next decades.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I very much like the point you made about cars and use of cars. I mean, use of cars on city streets is the most undemocratic thing you can do. Each car takes 25 square meters of space. Anything else takes less space.
Yeah.
Walking actually takes the least space. So you are taking away a very scarce resource, which is public space for personal use. And I must say, Deputy Minister, Prime Minister, that point, we have not been very successful in communicating how undemocratic it is.
That's right.
Use basically public space for private use. But I want to very much take the point you made that this is the best investment we can make for dollar spent to dollar return.
Absolutely.
And this return of capital point you're making for active mobility is such an important point. And I wish we would do, I'm looking at all the experts on my panel, we do more research, more campaigns on the return of capital point. I'm looking at Ben, you and Felipe and Marusha and Sandra, because I don't know whether we have done that enough, you know, the investment point, because the money is scarce, no matter which city you're in. So thank you very much, Deputy Minister. I want to remind all our audience, please submit your questions on the chat. I already see some exceptionally insightful question, which I'm very keen to go to soon. Someone is going to help me. Someone is helping me. So I'm going to come to those in a minute. But one thing that Marusha, you said about the just part of the transition, and these questions, if you can answer quickly, the next set of questions, I can go to the audience questions, which are really excellent right now. Marusha, one thing you said is about to make sure that this transition is just, which I think all of us agree. But one other thing that's really irritating about this transition is as richer countries become more conscious about low carbon transportation, UN Environment Program just published that between US, EU, and Japan, 14 million used cars were sent to, exported to poorer or developing countries that does not have similar existing strict regulation of using cars. But that's not a good outcome, right? It just went from one place to another place now. Emerging country residents are breathing worse air rather than richer countries. So what do we do about this movement? How do we stop this dumping of polluting cars to less rich or poorer countries?
Thanks for the question. It's a question about inequality. It's inequalities within countries and among countries. And the figures are, they speak by themselves. And actually, when you take them up to 2020, we see that is, going up, rising, keeps rising at quite impressive levels. It hinders the efforts to combat climate change. But yeah, it contributes to air pollution. And these vehicles often are involved in accidents. Many of these cars do not comply with roadworthiness standards in the countries that are exporting them. So let me be a bit provocative here, but it's a form of exporting misery and inequality, and perhaps we need to bear that in mind. We need to support low and middle income countries in this. They can say no to such inputs. What happened with the waste story? Over many decades, the European Union managed to meet its targets of waste recycling by just sending waste to other nations. One day, some countries said no, we are not emitting more waste import permits. This is it. And it confronted the European Union with the reality of its waste problem. And it actually triggered quite an interesting array of European Union targets and legislations and also national measures. So I see 4 areas in which we need to get a bit more aligned and perhaps they are mutually reinforcing. So they are, interconnected. First, we do need more action to regulate the trade with harmonized minimum quality standards. And this is what this fabulous report from the United Nations Environment Programme that you've mentioned, Annie, is really calling for. And we see very inspiring action already happening in some low and middle income countries. 15 countries from the Economic Community of West African states, Peru, Cambodia, Ethiopia, they have adopted standards. Space to watch is also this project called Safer and Cleaner Used Vehicles for Africa, with UNEP and other partners that are really trying to promote a global consensus on minimum requirements for both exporting and importing vehicles. A second message, I think that we need better policy coherence from high income countries that are exporting those types of vehicles. Coherence between climate policies, circular economy policies, development cooperation policies, and trade policies. A third message is that let's use an opportunity that we see arising. We do see many subnational and national jurisdictions from high-income countries setting targets to phase out internal combustion engines at a pace and at a rate that we hadn't seen before. So it'd be terrific to see this example of impressive leadership from these subnational and national jurisdictions in high-income countries, completing these targets with measures to regulate their exports, of course, within the remit of the powers that they might have. And the fourth message for me, to keep it tight, as you ask me, Annie, is that we need international financial institutions and public development banks, including, of course, the multilateral development banks, to dramatically increase the flows of investment that create more transport and mobility options in low and middle income countries than owning a private car. So the motorization rates that we see as a real risk, and that also support the manufacturing capacities and the skills for zero emission vehicles in these low and middle income countries themselves. I had the chance of being the first day intervention. So I've been, looking at the questions, and this is a question that was there as well. So these conversations somehow is connecting with much wider conversations about the reform of the global financial architecture, the Bridgetown Agenda, the United Nations Secretary General stimulus for the SDGs. But these are the conversations we need to have. So I'm going to keep it here because it'd be terrific to engage.
Marusha, thank you very much. Thank you. I think the policy coordination point you made is extremely important, and I want to make sure we have the right fora for that discussion. I'm going to move on to the excellent question that we have from our audience, and I'm going to just we have about a little more than 10 minutes left, and I beg you, all our wonderful panelists, to be brief in your response so I can actually get to all 4 of you. I'm going to start with you, Sandra. And Sandra, you must be wondering which of the questions I'm going to ask you. There's a really good question because we're talking about cities. And the question is, almost half the people in the world, little less right now, half the people live in rural areas, right? So cities is not the only transportation problem we have to solve. So what do we need to provide sustainable mobility in rural areas? What do we need to do? Try to answer in 2 minutes or less.
Well, in terms of connectivity and other things, probably other people are better placed. I have the electromobility lens, and I think that does work everywhere. I'm actually thinking, I'm German myself. I've recently been at home, and I found it very interesting to see that actually, if you go to the countryside, I love cycling, you see a lot of the local farms, they have their solar panel on the roof, and they're some of the first to have the charging stations in front of their house as well, because it doesn't means they don't have to go to the gas station. They have a whole system locally that works together. And obviously then for them, I guess in a rural context, the difficulty is, you know, it's difficult to organize a bus line that really works. So you might be more reliant on your private vehicle, but you can decarbonize that vehicle. And then I guess maybe you get into other things of, you know, some innovative options on how vehicles could still be shared if you get more on-demand transport options for those that aren't able to drive themselves or anything like that. I think there's others here that have probably more expertise in that area. But I think from the electromobility point of view specifically, I don't think it's a city versus rural thing. The solutions may be a bit different. We focused a lot on the cities because that's where a lot of the infrastructure comes together and you can serve a lot of people. But I do think it can play a role in the rural context as well. In particular, if you think about this electricity source, renewables, plus charging all together in a place where maybe there's a bit more space for those installations.
I absolutely think you're right. I mean, whether it's electric or not, I think rural mobility is as important for us to think about, and connectivity to markets for rural development. Maybe when I get to Ben can respond. The World Bank has very large programs on it. But I want to go to Minister Bosch for you for a second. There's a very interesting question about behavioral shifts we need for us to succeed. So this is a question from the audience. How do we shift from the behavioral shift that we need from driving cars to using public transport more frequently? What have we learned from Luxembourg that has been successful?
This answer is in fact very simple. It's only the quality of the system of the public transport who makes people change the behavior. I give you one example. We have launched in Luxembourg a new city tram in 2017, and this tram line that is now running, the first line is now running, has an enormous high quality. You have a tram every 3 minutes. It's on its own network, so never stuck in traffic congestion. The quality of the vehicles are excellent, and we are breaking records now since 2017 every month. So we have now already tripled the passengers that are now on the tram compared of what we transported by buses on this line before, because you had a lot of buses trying to really go to connect people on where the tram is now running. So quality is really the key moment so that people change to the public transport. And I'm also to add something concerning the rural areas. It's clear the rural areas are different than the urban areas, but also in the rural areas, first of all, you have also there 50% of the traffic is under 5 kilometers. It's inside the village or around the village, from one village to another. So that's not everything, not every movement that is done in the rural area it's long distance. But then for a long distance, for example, for somebody who has to commute from a rural area to an urban area, you can also combine. You can maybe say, okay, this guy can use maybe an electric car to do the first 10 kilometers and until the first railway station that exists, and there you build a park and ride lot so that he can leave his car and then combine his electric car with the railway, for example. So it's a question of the quality. The quality of the system must match, otherwise nobody will change.
Everybody, I want to move on because we're going to run out of time. I agree. I think our audience listening to you must be thinking that, you know, this could happen in Luxembourg and nowhere else. But that actually is not true. Felipe, I'm going to bring you in here. Felipe ran the system in Bogota, and Bogota has been very successful also getting people on bikes and improving the program. Felipe, you don't have that much time. Would love to hear your reflection on behavior shifts, how to encourage people to get off cars to other systems.
Thank you, Annie. I think it's a very difficult thing to do in cities because, of course, we have to fight with industry who is putting on the stage cars and is showing people that they deserve to drive. However, I think the best way to do it is somehow, as the minister was saying, building infrastructure that relies on what people is needing. Public transport, more bike lanes. For example, in Bogota, we already have 10% of the trips done by bikes, and it's very important. And also, we have 1485 electric buses already running in the city. So cities have to understand, or governments have to understand, that they work mainly for vulnerable people, and vulnerable people move especially in public transport systems, walking or biking, and that's what we want for people to move on. So shift is very difficult, but still the infrastructure and providing the accessibility for people is what we need in our cities.
But both of you, I think the quality of the system is a critical ingredient here, which I think both of you pointed out. Felipe, I know you want to say something, but I want to go to Ben for a minute before we run out of time. Ben, I want you to comment quickly on two things. There's a really interesting question on hydrogen. The question is whether we should focus on hydrogen or focus on electrification, or the question of choice, basically. This is something the bank is working a lot on. And also the rural question. I thought that was a very interesting one. If you can briefly respond to both of them.
Sure, thank you, Annie. Yeah, hydrogen versus battery electric is a big question. And in fact, it's quite worrisome because we may be locking ourselves into a path dependency approach that may be less optimal than what it should be. You know, the market sometimes chooses the wrong technology. So we're saying battery electric, of course, dominating the private vehicle, the light duty vehicle. 90+% of electric vehicles are from that. Hydrogen is becoming more important for those so-called hard to abate sectors, such as maritime, long distance trucks, railways, and to some extent aviation as well. But the economics of hydrogen is quite complicated because you have to use so many energy even to create hydrogen cell. And there's a lot of debate whether that is, you're losing a lot of energies in the electrolysis process. But I think we have to do that in the maritime sector, also even to some extent in the trucking sector. The price is not, the economics doesn't favor hydrogen. If you look at the maritime sector, they use very cheap, very dirty fuel. When you compare it with hydrogen, it's super expensive. So the shifting cost, the transaction cost, or the economic cost for shifting is quite high. So what this is calling is for really carbon pricing to make sure that the maritime sector actually then pays the true price of the cost. So if you do introduce some level of carbon levy on the international corridors, then you can start making sure that hydrogen starts making sense. We're also seeing a lot of initiatives in that space with the IMO and other big shippers moving towards cleaner fuel. But I think hydrogen and ammonia are where people are using it. To touch on the issue about rural accessibility, yeah, rural accessibility is super important, but the focus has been mostly on infrastructure, I have to say. You build rural roads, but the services often do not come because this is it's a thin demand. So the characteristics of a thin market is that you really need to invest quite a lot on the service, unlike in urban areas. The passengers are already there. They come to you when you have a bus service or a minibus service. But if it's in a rural area, getting the passengers to come to a more formal operation is very difficult. So sometimes those places are underserved. So they call for a much more coordinated way, or just going through the two-wheelers and three-wheelers approach. As maybe one, many people have used it. In China, two-wheelers and three-wheelers, even the electric ones, were very viable. But also, I think Minister Bosch was trying to say that in terms of combining freight and passenger services, because a lot of the rural economy rely on some of the export or evacuation of goods, but you can combine it with private testing. But one final thing, if I may say, is on the
And we're in
industrial.
time. You have to wrap up quickly.
Yeah, just 30 seconds. I agree with the comment, I think it was from Anne Jocelyn, about using the electrification agenda to create industries in developing countries. We have to make sure they actually benefit from that transition, from creating jobs and industrialization. Hydrogen generation actually has a good point there. Adding value in the materials for batteries is also one, and assembly of two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and electric buses. At least assembly is within their reach. Thank you,
Thank you,
Annie.
Ben.
Over to you.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you to all our phenomenal panelists. Thank you so much for this. And all of you that have joined this particular discussion. I want to thank you for joining. This is just a curtain raiser. There's a lot more of this discussion to come next week. Please join us virtually or otherwise and Transforming Transportation. I really want to thank our audience today. The questions that you put in, we were not able to answer all of them. Really brilliant question, which we will record. My takeaway from this, as you can well imagine, the transition to the transport system is absolutely needed. But not only it's needed a systems approach, but also an approach that actually is more equitable. So the outcome we're looking for is more mobility for more people, and not just some mobility for some people. And as you from all of them, that if you take that approach, you actually get a system that's better, that's more efficient. And I underline what Deputy Prime Minister said, also more economically efficient. You spend less money to get better outcome. Thank you for joining. Hope to see a lot of you next week. Thank you, our wonderful panelists. I hope to see you physically next week, all of you in DC. Thanks a lot for joining.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so very much.
Bye-bye.
See you all next week. Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Thanks.